In this lecture, Neville Goddard reveals one of the most radical truths of conscious creation. You do not change your life by effort, but by assumption. To live in the fulfilled desire means to mentally and emotionally occupy the state of your wish already realized. Now, not someday. Neville teaches that reality is not something happening to you, it is something flowing from you. Every circumstance, condition, and experience in your world is the faithful reflection of what you are inwardly living as true. This teaching invites you to stop waiting for external proof and instead become the proof within. When you live from the end, feeling, thinking, and identifying as the person who already has what they desire, you activate the creative law that governs all manifestation. The outer world must rearrange itself to mirror this inner conviction. Transformation does not require struggle, force, or time. It requires a shift in consciousness. As Neville often emphasized, dare to assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, and the assumption will harden into fact. This is the art of living in the fulfilled desire, and it is how reality is transformed. The feeling of fulfillment is the creative power, because feeling is the language through which consciousness speaks to itself. Man does not create by effort, willpower, or struggle. He creates by acceptance. What you feel to be true of yourself, you are, and what you are, you express. Feeling is not emotion in the surface sense, but the deep inner knowing that something is so. When you feel that your desire is already fulfilled, you have moved into the state where creation is complete. Nothing further is required. Neville taught that creation is finished. Every possible state already exists. You are not bringing something into being. You are selecting a state and occupying it. Feeling is the act of occupation. When you feel yourself to be the person who already has the thing desired, you have entered that state. At that moment, the creative act is done. The world you see with your eyes has no choice but to rearrange itself to reflect that inner occupancy. Most people attempt to change their lives by manipulating the outside, changing jobs, relationships, locations, or circumstances, while remaining inwardly the same. But the outer world is only an echo. It has no creative power of its own. It faithfully mirrors the feeling you consistently live in. If you feel unfulfilled, reality must show you unfulfillment. If you feel complete, reality must show you completion. Feeling is the cause, the world is the effect. To live in the fulfilled desire is to feel natural about having it. This is the true test. When the idea of your wish being fulfilled feels ordinary rather than exciting, distant, or miraculous, you have entered the correct state. Neville emphasized that manifestation does not come from excitement or longing, but from naturalness. The state you are truly in feels like home. It feels normal. It feels obvious. When you can say inwardly, "Of course, this is my life," without effort or emotional strain, the state has been accepted. Imagination is the workshop of creation, but feeling is the substance with which imagination works. You may imagine scenes endlessly, but if the feeling underneath them is doubt, lack, or waiting, then that is the state you are actually occupying. Feeling reveals what you truly believe. You can say affirmations all day, but the feeling you return to when you are quiet is the state that will objectify itself. This is why Neville urged students to enter the feeling of the wish fulfilled before sleep, when the mind is relaxed and receptive. In that drowsy state, feeling impresses itself most easily upon consciousness. The reason feeling is so powerful is because consciousness does not reason. It accepts. Whatever you feel to be true is accepted without question and projected outward as experience. You do not need to convince consciousness with logic. You simply need to feel. When you feel wealthy, you are wealthy in consciousness. When you feel loved, you are loved in consciousness. And consciousness is the only reality. The visible world is merely its delayed reflection. This is also why effort delays manifestation. Effort implies that something is missing. Struggle implies resistance. Wanting implies lack. But feeling fulfilled implies completion. When you stop trying to make something happen and instead rest in the feeling that it has already happened, you remove resistance. The seed is planted and nature takes over. You do not dig up a seed every day to see if it is growing. You trust the law. In the same way, when you feel fulfilled, you trust consciousness to externalize that fulfillment. Neville often said that the moment you feel it real, it is done. Not will be done, but it is done. The world may not reflect it immediately, but that is irrelevant. The cause has already been set in motion. Time is only the interval required for the state to express itself in three-dimensional form. Your task is not to make it happen, but to remain faithful to the feeling that it already is. Living from the feeling of fulfillment also changes your behavior naturally. You do not force action. Action flows. You think differently, speak differently, and respond differently, not because you are trying to manifest, but because you are different. This is the most important point Neville made. You do not act to become, you act because you already are. When the feeling changes, the behavior follows effortlessly. If you feel yourself to be successful, you will naturally make decisions from that state. If you feel yourself to be confident, you will naturally express confidence. These actions are not techniques, they are symptoms. The outer life rearranges itself without conscious planning, because the inner state has shifted. This is transformation at its root. Many people fail because they visit the feeling of fulfillment briefly, and then return to the feeling of lack. They imagine once and then spend the rest of the day checking reality, reacting to appearances, and affirming that nothing has changed. But the law does not respond to occasional imagination, it responds to dwelling. Where you dwell in feeling is where you live. Neville called this mental occupancy. You must occupy the fulfilled state as your dwelling place, not as a temporary escape. To live in the fulfilled desire means that even when appearances contradict it, you do not abandon the feeling. You do not fight appearances. You simply refuse to accept them as final. You know that they are the residue of a previous state and will fade as the new state becomes dominant. This inner loyalty is what Neville called faith, not belief in something outside of you, but faith in your own wonderful human imagination. Ultimately, feeling is the secret because feeling is identity. You manifest what you are conscious of being. When you feel fulfilled, you are fulfilled in consciousness, and consciousness must express itself. There is no other power at work. No external force decides your fate. You are both the cause and the effect. When you accept this and dare to feel the wish fulfilled, you step into your true creative nature. And once you do, reality has no choice but to follow. To live from the end is to reverse the habit of a lifetime. Man has been trained to believe that he must first see, then believe, first receive, then feel, first experience, then know. Neville taught the opposite. You must first assume, then experience. The end is not something you move toward in time, it is a state you move into in consciousness. The moment you occupy the end, the journey is complete. Even if the outer world has not yet caught up, most people live from the middle. They constantly ask, how will this happen? Or when will it change? But the very act of questioning keeps them bound to the state of not having. The mind that seeks the way is confessing that the end is not yet attained. Neville insisted that the how is none of your concern. The means are not your responsibility. Life itself arranges the bridge of incidents once the end is accepted as fact. When you live from the end, you are no longer imagining to get, but imagining from having. This is the critical distinction. Imagining to get implies distance, effort, and waiting. Imagining from having implies completion. You do not picture the desire approaching you. You picture yourself after it has arrived. You think from the state, speak from the state, and feel from the state. This is what Neville meant by thinking from, not of. The end must be simple and definite. Neville advised choosing a short imaginal scene that would naturally occur after the desire is fulfilled. A handshake congratulating you, a friend telling you how happy they are for you, a check already deposited, a ring already on your finger. These are not fantasies, but symbolic confirmations. When you enter such a scene and feel it to be real, you are dwelling in the end. But the real secret is not the scene itself, it is the assumption. The scene is only a tool to help you accept the state. Once the assumption feels natural, the scene can be dropped. The end has been accepted, and life must now move to confirm it. Neville often reminded his students that imagining is not pretending, it is experiencing reality on a higher level. Living from the end requires mental discipline, not force, but fidelity. The mind will attempt to return to old patterns because they feel familiar. Appearances may contradict your assumption. Others may doubt you. Circumstances may seem unchanged. But these are simply the after effects of a previous state. To react to them is to step back into the old state. To remain inwardly loyal to the end is to allow the new state to stabilize. This is why Neville emphasized persistence. not repetition for the sake of repetition, but persistence in being. You persist by returning again and again to the feeling of the fulfilled state whenever you notice yourself slipping into doubt. You do not fight doubt, you replace it. You gently shift your attention back to the end, as one would return home after wandering. When you truly live from the end, impatience disappears. There is nothing to wait for. You may still have preferences about timing, but you are no longer anxious. Anxiety belongs to the state of wanting. Peace belongs to the state of having. Neville often said that the sign of successful imagining is inner relief. You feel done, you feel settled, you feel at ease. This inner stillness is the mark of acceptance. Living from the end also changes your relationship with action. You do not force action or attempt to make things happen. Action arises naturally as part of the bridge of incidents. You may be inspired to make a call, go somewhere, speak to someone, but these actions feel effortless, not pressured. You are not acting to get the desire, you are acting because the desire is already fulfilled, and this is the natural movement of life. One of the greatest obstacles to living from the end is moralizing the process. People wonder if they are worthy, if it is right, or if they should wait until conditions improve. Neville dismissed all such concerns. Consciousness is impersonal, it does not judge, it simply expresses what you assume to be true. The law works the same for all, regardless of past mistakes or present limitations. Another obstacle is attachment to the old story. Many people secretly enjoy repeating the narrative of struggle, lack, or injustice because it has become part of their identity. Living from the end requires letting go of that identity. You cannot carry the old self into the new state. You must die to the former concept of self and be reborn as the one who already has. This is the true meaning of transformation. Neville often used biblical language to describe this process, saying that you must enter the Sabbath, a state of rest after the work is done. The work is not physical labor, but the act of assumption. Once the end is assumed, you rest. You do not strain, visualize compulsively, or seek signs. You simply live. And as you live from the end, life mirrors it back to you. Over time, the fulfilled state becomes your new normal. What once felt like imagination becomes memory. What once felt like desire becomes fact. This is not magic, it is law. You are not bending reality, you are selecting from infinite states. When you consistently live from the end, you discover that there was never a journey at all, only a change in awareness. To live from the end is to claim your creative authority. You are no longer at the mercy of circumstances, people, or chance. You recognize that the world is responding to you, not controlling you. And when this realization becomes natural, transformation is inevitable. Reality does not resist the one who knows the end and dares to live there now. Your state of consciousness is the sole cause of everything you experience, whether you are aware of it or not. Neville Goddard taught that there is no power outside of consciousness shaping your world. The conditions of your life, your health, finances, relationships, are opportunities, are not accidents, nor are they imposed upon you by fate, luck, or other people. They are the faithful expression of the state you are occupying within. Change the state, and the world must change in response. A state of consciousness is simply a way of being. It is a collection of assumptions, beliefs, feelings, and inner conversations that you accept as true. You move through countless states throughout your life, often unconsciously. One moment you may feel confident and capable, another moment insecure and doubtful. Each state carries its own world with it. When you occupy a state long enough, it externalizes itself as experience. Most people believe that circumstances create their state, but this is an illusion. The outer world only reflects. If circumstances were the cause, then two people in identical situations would have identical experiences. Yet one thrives where another struggles. The difference is not the condition, but the consciousness with which it is met. The same environment, when filtered through different states, produces entirely different realities. Neville explained that consciousness is like a projector, and the world is the screen. You cannot change the picture on the screen by touching the screen. You must change the slide in the projector. Trying to fix the outer world without changing the inner state is like rearranging shadows, while leaving the object casting them untouched. The shadow will always return to its original form until the source is changed. Your habitual inner conversations are one of the clearest indicators of your state. What you say to yourself when no one else is listening reveals who you are being. If your inner speech is filled with complaints, fears, or expectations of failure, you are occupying a state that must reproduce those conditions. If your inner speech is confident, grateful, and expectant of good, you are occupying a state that must express that as well. You are always telling yourself who you are, and consciousness listens. States are not permanent unless you make them so. This is the great freedom Neville offered. No matter how long you have lived in a particular condition, you are only one assumption away from a new state. The moment you see that your present reality is not fixed, but fluid, you regain your creative power. You are not trapped. You are simply identified with a state you can leave. To change your world, you must be willing to change your concept of self. The world does not respond to what you want, it responds to what you assume yourself to be. If you assume yourself to be unlucky, life will find countless ways to confirm it. If you assume yourself to be valued, supported, and successful, life will reorganize to prove it. The assumption comes first, the evidence follows. Neville often emphasized that you do not need to fight or suppress an old state. States fade when they are no longer occupied. When you shift your attention and loyalty to a new state, the old one loses its power naturally. This is why force is unnecessary. You do not overcome a state by resisting it, but by withdrawing belief from it. The difficulty for many is that states feel real. When you are in a state of fear, the world looks threatening. When you are in a state of lack, everything seems scarce. These perceptions feel factual, but they are interpretations shaped by the state. Neville urged students to recognize that what they see is not reality itself, but reality filtered through consciousness. When you understand this, you stop arguing with appearances. Changing states requires imagination, but more importantly, it requires consent. You must allow yourself to be the one you desire to be. Many people secretly resist this because it challenges their familiar identity. The state of struggle, while painful, can feel safer because it is known. The new state demands that you release old justifications and stories. But once you dare to assume a new identity, consciousness accepts it instantly. This is why Neville taught the importance of feeling the wish fulfilled. Feeling is the evidence that you have entered the state. When you feel natural calm and inwardly satisfied about a new condition, you have shifted consciousness. You may still see old circumstances, but they no longer define you. You know they are temporary echoes. As you remain in the new state, reality rearranges itself through what Neville called the bridge of incidents. Events unfold naturally without strain or planning. You may not recognize the bridge while crossing it, and you are not meant to control it. Your only responsibility is to remain faithful to the state you have chosen. The bridge exists because the end has been accepted. Another crucial insight Neville offered is that no one else is to blame. Others appear to act independently, but they are playing roles assigned by your state. This does not mean they lack free will. It means they reflect the concept you hold of yourself and of them. When you change your state, their behavior toward you changes accordingly. The world is responding to your self-concept, not acting against it. When this understanding becomes clear, resentment dissolves. You stop seeing yourself as a victim of circumstances and begin to see yourself as a participant in creation. Responsibility replaces blame, not as a burden but as liberation. If you created it unconsciously, you can recreate it consciously. Ultimately, the world is not something you must control, it is something you must understand. It is a living mirror, reflecting back your assumptions with precision. When you accept that your state of consciousness is the cause, you stop reacting and start choosing. You no longer ask why things are happening to you, you ask who you are being. As you practice this awareness, life becomes fluid. Conditions lose their power to define you. You recognize that nothing is final, nothing is fixed, and nothing is beyond change. By changing your state of consciousness, you are not hoping for a better future, you are selecting it. And once selected, reality has no alternative but to express it. Persistence is not the repetition of words or the mechanical return to imaginal acts, it is loyalty to a state. Neville Goddard made it clear that assumption becomes fact not through intensity but through continuance. What you persist in assuming, despite appearances, solidifies into reality. The outer world may delay, resist, or even contradict your assumption, but it cannot ultimately deny what is persistently occupied in consciousness. The moment you assume a new state, you have planted a seed. That seed does not reveal itself immediately because it must pass through its appointed interval of time. During this interval, the senses will attempt to persuade you that nothing has changed. This is the testing period. Most people fail here not because the law does not work, but because they abandon the state when it is most vulnerable. They interpret delay as denial and return to the old assumption. Neville warned that the world you see after imagining is not a sign of failure, but evidence of success. What appears is the residue of a previous state. It has momentum. Just as a train does not stop instantly when the brakes are applied, reality does not shift the moment you change consciousness. Persistence is required to allow the old momentum to run out while the new direction takes hold. To persist means to refuse to draw conclusions from appearances. Appearances are not facts, they are reflections of former assumptions. When you react emotionally to them, you re-enter the old state. When you observe them without surrendering your inner conviction, you remain in the new state. This inner refusal is not denial, but understanding. You know the outer world must conform in time. Persistence does not mean constant visualization. Neville often cautioned against exhausting the imagination. Once the feeling of the wish fulfilled has been accepted, repetition becomes unnecessary. Persistence then takes the form of mental discipline, returning to the assumed state whenever the mind wanders back to doubt, fear, or impatience. It is a gentle, steady dwelling, not a strained effort. The true test of persistence appears in moments of contradiction. When circumstances move in the opposite direction, the untrained mind panics. But Neville taught that these moments are often part of the bridge of incidents. Life may rearrange itself in ways that seem unrelated or even unfavorable at first. If you judge too quickly, you may misinterpret progress as failure. Persistence requires trust in the law rather than faith in appearances. Inner conversations play a decisive role here. What you say inwardly when things seem unchanged determines whether you persist or retreat. If your inner dialogue becomes, "It's not working," or "Maybe this isn't possible," you have shifted states. But if your inner dialogue remains, "It is done," or "This is unfolding perfectly," you remain loyal to the assumption. Neville insisted that inner speech is the most constant form of persistence. Another misunderstanding about persistence is the belief that it requires emotional intensity. In truth, emotional calm is a sign of success. When you persist correctly, anxiety fades. You feel settled even when evidence is lacking. This calmness is not indifference, but certainty. You no longer strain to make something happen because you know it already has in consciousness. Persistence also requires you to let go of time pressure. The moment you demand immediate results, you are confessing doubt. Time is not an enemy. It is simply the medium through which states express themselves. Neville reminded students that everything has its appointed hour. When you accept this, impatience dissolves, and persistence becomes effortless. One of the greatest challenges in persistence is the temptation to return to old emotional habits. The old state will attempt to reclaim you by offering familiar feelings: fear, resentment, self-pity, or hopelessness. These emotions are not caused by circumstances. They are invitations to re-enter the former identity. To persist is to decline the invitation. You acknowledge the feeling, but you do not dwell there. Neville often described persistence as remaining faithful to an unseen reality. This faith is not blind belief but knowing based on law. Just as gravity does not fail because you do not see it, the law of assumption does not fail because results are delayed. Your role is not to monitor progress, but to remain in the state that implies fulfillment. When you persist, something subtle but powerful happens. The new state begins to feel more real than the old world. Your reactions change. You respond differently to people and situations. You think differently without effort. These inner shifts are signs that the assumption is taking root. Even if the outer world has not yet changed, you have. Eventually, the old state collapses. Circumstances rearrange, people change their behavior, opportunities appear, and conditions shift, often suddenly and naturally. When this happens, it may feel ordinary, even inevitable. Neville noted that manifestations rarely feel dramatic when they arrive. They feel like the natural outcome of who you have become. Persistence is the bridge between assumption and fact. It is not something you do once, but something you are. You persist by living from the identity you have chosen, regardless of what the world temporarily shows you. When you understand this, persistence is no longer difficult. It becomes the simplest thing in the world. You remain who you have decided to be. In the end, reality does not test you to see if you deserve your desire. It tests you to see if you will remain loyal to your assumption. When you do, the law never fails. The assumption hardens into fact, and the world reshapes itself to match the state you refuse to abandon. Imagination is not a fantasy faculty reserved for artists or dreamers. It is the very substance of reality itself. Neville Goddard taught that imagination is God in action, the creative power operating within every individual. What you imagine with feeling is not a symbolic act. It is a real event occurring on a higher plane of reality. The physical world you see is only the shadow cast by imaginal activity that has already taken place. Man has been conditioned to trust his senses above all else. He believes what he can touch, measure, and see with his eyes. But Neville reversed this belief entirely. He insisted that the senses are late reporters. They do not reveal truth, they reveal results. Imagination, on the other hand, reveals causes. What you accept as real in imagination must, by law, express itself in the world of form. When you imagine, you are not creating something new. You are selecting a reality that already exists. Infinite states exist simultaneously, and imagination is the means by which you move from one state to another. The moment you imagine a scene and feel it to be real, you have entered that state. Physical reality then reorganizes itself to reflect your new position in consciousness. The reason imagination is misunderstood is because people treat it as pretending. Neville was emphatic that imagining is experiencing. When you imagine something vividly and accept it as true, consciousness makes no distinction between that imaginal act and a physical event. Both are equally real to the creative power within you. The only difference is the level at which they occur. This is why Neville urged his students to give imagination precedence over sensory evidence. If the senses contradict imagination, imagination must be accepted as the greater reality. To do otherwise is to place effect above cause. When you trust appearances more than imagination, you surrender your creative authority to shadows. Imagination becomes effective when it is entered with feeling. A lifeless image produces little result. But when imagination is accompanied by the feeling of reality, when it feels natural, solid, and convincing, you have impressed the subconscious mind. That impression is law. It must express itself, just as a seed must grow after being planted in fertile soil. Neville explained that the subconscious mind is not selective. It accepts whatever is impressed upon it. It does not judge truth or falsehood. It does not argue or reason. It simply expresses. When you imagine failure and feel it to be real, the subconscious expresses failure. When you imagine success and feel it to be real, the subconscious expresses success. You are always imagining, whether consciously or unconsciously. Most people use imagination against themselves. They replay negative conversations, imagine unwanted outcomes, and feel fear as if it were fact. These imaginal acts are just as creative as positive ones. The law does not discriminate. It faithfully reproduces what is imagined with feeling, regardless of whether it is wanted or unwanted. To reclaim imagination as the true reality, you must become aware of how you are using it. Neville taught that every moment of awareness is an imaginal act. Even remembering the past is imagination at work. When you relive a painful memory and feel it again, you are re-entering that state and keeping it alive. When you revise the memory in imagination and feel relief, you alter its effect on your present and future. This understanding leads to one of Neville's most powerful teachings: revision. By revising past events in imagination and accepting the revised version as true, you change the state from which the future unfolds. This alone demonstrates that imagination is not fantasy, it is causation. The past, present, and future are all contained in consciousness and can be reshaped through imaginal acts. Imagination must be trained to obey. Left undisciplined, it wanders into fear and limitation. Disciplined imagination, however, becomes the servant of your highest assumption. Neville did not advocate controlling every thought, but he did insist on controlling the direction of feeling. When you notice imagination drifting into unwanted territory, you gently redirect it to the fulfilled state. As imagination becomes dominant, the physical world loses its authority over you. You stop reacting emotionally to appearances because you understand they are delayed reflections. You respond inwardly instead. This does not make you passive, it makes you powerful. You act from imagination rather than from reaction. Living from imagination also dissolves doubt. Doubt arises when you look to the senses for confirmation. Faith arises when you trust imagination as reality. Neville defined faith as loyalty to an unseen reality. When imagination feels more real to you than appearances, doubt has no foundation. Eventually, imagination becomes your dwelling place. You live inwardly in the reality you have chosen, and the outer world follows. When results appear, they feel natural, even inevitable. You may forget that you once imagined them. This forgetfulness is not failure, it is success. The imaginal act has hardened into fact and no longer requires attention. In the final understanding, there is no separation between imagination and reality. There is only reality seen from different levels. What you call imagination today is the physical world of tomorrow. When you accept this, you no longer ask whether imagination works. You know it does, because it is the only thing that ever has. To trust imagination is to trust yourself. And when you do, you discover that the power you were seeking outside has always been within, quietly shaping your world according to what you dare to imagine and accept as true. Transformation does not come through force, effort, or strain, it comes through alignment. Neville Goddard consistently taught that when you are truly living in the fulfilled desire, nothing feels forced. There is no tension, no desperation, no need to make things happen. Life flows, moves, and rearranges itself naturally, because you are no longer pushing against it. You are cooperating with the law instead of resisting it. Force belongs to the state of lack. When you feel you must try harder, control outcomes, or manipulate circumstances, you are confessing inwardly that the desire is not yet yours. Effort implies separation. Fulfillment implies unity. When the desire is assumed as already fulfilled, effort drops away because there is nothing left to pursue. You are no longer chasing life, life is responding to you. Neville explained that all true action is inspired action. It arises spontaneously from the state you occupy. When you are in the state of fulfillment, you do not calculate your moves or overthink your steps. You simply act when action is required, and those actions feel obvious, natural, and unforced. They are not strategies, they are expressions. Just as a tree does not struggle to bear fruit, the fulfilled state does not struggle to express itself. Many people believe that if they stop forcing, nothing will happen. This fear comes from a misunderstanding of how reality works. They assume that effort is the cause of results. Neville revealed that state is the cause, and action is the effect. When the state is right, action takes care of itself. When the state is wrong, no amount of action can permanently change outcomes. This is why people often exhaust themselves trying to change their lives. They act from the old state while hoping for new results. They work harder, affirm louder, visualize longer, yet inwardly remain the same. The law cannot be fooled. It does not respond to activity, it responds to identity. When identity shifts, behavior and circumstances follow effortlessly. Transformation feels natural because it is natural. You are not becoming something foreign, you are returning to a state that already exists. Creation is finished. Every fulfilled version of you already lives within consciousness. When you assume one of these states, you are not forcing change. You are allowing expression. The strain disappears because resistance disappears. Neville often said that the sign of successful imagining is relief. Relief is not excitement or emotional intensity. It is quiet certainty. It is the feeling that something is settled, resolved, and complete. When relief appears, effort vanishes. You stop checking, stop doubting, and stop trying to control the process. This is not giving up, it is giving way. When you are truly living in the fulfilled desire, you may still take action, but the quality of that action is entirely different. There is no urgency behind it, no fear, no pressure. You move because it feels right, not because you are afraid of losing something. This is inspired movement, and it always leads you across the bridge of incidents in perfect order. Even challenges that arise no longer feel like obstacles. They feel like part of the unfolding. You respond instead of react. You trust instead of resist. This trust is not naive optimism, it is understanding of the law. You know that the state you occupy determines the outcome, so temporary appearances cannot disturb you. Force also disappears in your inner world. You stop forcing thoughts to be positive. You stop suppressing doubt aggressively. Instead, You gently return to the feeling of fulfillment whenever you notice yourself drifting. This softness is power. Neville taught that consciousness responds to acceptance, not domination. The moment you accept the fulfilled state as natural, the subconscious receives it without resistance. This naturalness is what allows reality to transform smoothly. Sudden dramatic changes may still occur, but they feel strangely ordinary when they do. Neville often noted that manifestations rarely feel miraculous once they arrive. They feel like the only possible outcome. This is because consciousness has already adjusted to the state long before the world reflects it. Living without force also changes how you relate to time. You are no longer racing against it. You are no longer anxious about delays. Time becomes a neutral medium rather than an enemy. You understand that everything unfolds at the moment it feels natural to consciousness. Until then, you rest. Perhaps the greatest freedom in this teaching is the realization that you are not here to struggle your way into a better life. You are here to assume a better state. Once assumed, life handles the details. The burden lifts, the pressure dissolves. You stop trying to deserve what is already yours by law. And so transformation happens quietly, not with effort but with ease, not with struggle but with surrender to truth. You do not fight the old self, you simply stop feeding it. You do not chase the new life, you allow it to express itself through you. When you truly understand Neville's teaching, you realize that life was never meant to be hard. Difficulty arises only when you live from the wrong state. The moment you dare to live in the fulfilled desire, force falls away, resistance dissolves, and reality begins to move with you instead of against you. You are not here to push the river, you are here to step into its flow. And once you do, transformation is no longer something you seek, it becomes something you live.